So, the myth of World War II. A lot of people talk about this. They talk about the World War II consensus and all of these things. And I want to talk to you about why this is important to talk about right now and what it actually might mean for how you interface with the world, how you see the world. So, what are we talking about with the myth of World War II? Well, a myth, in this case, this is kind of a foundational myth, contains a bunch of things within it. I have a video that I've done sort of on the definition of myth, so I'll try to link that here. But it also has a momentum, right? Because it's such a all-encompassing story, right? It's such an all-encompassing sort of thing that pulls so many parts together at once. It's not a mere story, it's a myth. It has momentum that a regular story doesn't have. So a very popular book might sell so many millions of copies for so long, right? And then fades into existence, and maybe it becomes a classic and maybe it doesn't. With a myth, that doesn't happen. Because you're tying so many things together, you're making sense of so many things at once. You're bringing meaning into the world. That's one of the things that myths do. It may not be the only way to bring meaning into the world, and it may not be the only thing myths do, but that is one of the things that myths do. And because you're bringing meaning into the world, it's a lot of momentum from the past. So there's a lot of momentum leading up to World War II. I will try to cover that a little bit here, but mostly I'll have to do that in a different video because there's a lot there. And if you want to see that, you just need to watch the history playlist on this channel, and you'll find some of that momentum right there because I've already outlined most of it. In fact, the last piece should be coming soon. I could have another talk with Adam. He's getting settled after he got married and everything. So this momentum that's happened from this myth of World War II that we'll say is the pinnacle, maybe, of materialism as such in the age of Gnosis. I've covered the age of Gnosis elsewhere. And so materialism is just believing that the material is the prime mover. So in other words, not God, for example, which by definition would always be the prime mover. Set that one aside. It's material. And so if you just arrange the material in a certain way, you get a certain result. And you see this not starting with World War II, but starting with the lead up to World War I. Right. And so we can go into all kinds of wacky history about, the beginning of the Great War and how it all happened. Right. And I do think it's the Great War in two acts, roughly speaking. That's the better way to think about these things. Framing matters a lot. And so what causes World War II? The Treaty of Versailles. Also, a lot of bad things come out of Versailles. I don't know why. Maybe Versailles was a corrupt endeavor from the beginning. Hint, hint. But a lot of bad historical things happen at Versailles, or happen as the result of things that happen at Versailles. That is the result of following treaties, we'll say, to the letter. Very German thing to do, right? That causes the beginning of the Great War. And then the second act of the Great War is caused by the, we'll call it, incomplete or unfair resolution of the first act of the Great War. Perfectly reasonable way to think about it. I didn't come up with this. Lots of people made this observation since forever. I did validate it by reading some of the most important documents, right? So that idea is important. But what is the myth of World War II? What sorts of things does it set down? Well, it sets down a clear path of good versus evil. That path is accessible to everybody. Hitler bad, not Hitler not bad. This doesn't last long, obviously. The Cold War is evidence, or I would say concrete proof, that this doesn't last, this formula doesn't last long. It sort of morphs almost immediately. It sets down that, in fact, with superior numbers, you can win a war, okay? This is a historical anomaly. There's no evidence, if you actually just do the data science on it, that superior numbers always wins. That's certainly not the case, right? But in World War II, we sort of get, well, we've got these superior numbers in the form of technology mostly, not in necessarily the form of men, right? But in the form of technology, that wins the war. And you can make the argument that the first form of technology was actually the German technology, and that we're still living off that technology. I've made this point elsewhere, but almost everything we have, and I can actually make an argument for the transistor, since the first transistor patent was in fact German from that time, or just before that time. And in fact, one of the first computers was German. That all of our technology today is German, all of it. It all comes out of the legacy of Germany from the Great War, the whole thing, pretty much everything you interact with. There are a few exceptions to that, of course, but they're precious few, right? Still, our most efficient and greatest source of power is nuclear power. That's German. I mean, it's so German that even in places where the scientists that sort of forwarded that technology, who left Germany first for whatever reason, they were still German. So this is a very German adventure that we're on in some ways. So that is part of that legacy. This superiority of technology idea is at least cemented, not started, but clearly cemented within the mythos of World War II. Right? And it has a great deal of momentum. That's not going away very quickly. The internet is sort of the culmination of that. And as the internet continues to fail to live up to actually any of the promises that were made to justify it, because so far that's true, I think, that will go away, but that's going to take a very long time. People are very addicted to their internet for very good reasons. I think the whole project of something like the internet is effectively born out of this World War II mythos directly. I mean, it's not, this isn't hard, right? It's a DARPA project from the US military, and one of the first places we put the internet was Germany, weirdly enough, because we had bases over there, right? And so this fast communication, or this idea of speed, sort of comes out of the Blitzkrieg, which is how certain dictators were super successful early on with Blitzkrieg. And so you can see how all of these sorts of things play in to this myth. Now, how true they are, or whether or not they're true even a little bit, that's a longer video. That would take a lot more research, but I wanted to point to a few of them. And so that you see the threads. The idea is to get the thread of how much the myth of World War II, this World War II, quote, consensus, that's the political version, by the way, of the myth of World War II, is that how does it affect politics? That's the consensus. That's how it affects politics, right? How much this invades your thoughts. So let's look a little bit about the World War II consensus, because it's not the same as the myth of World War II. It's a sub-myth of World War II, if you will. It's a myth for the political elite, if such a thing exists. And I think we've tried to create such a thing. To the extent that it exists, I'm probably a no, but also it's trying to exist. It's been trying to exist since before the Great War. And this is Otto von Bismarck. This is his fault, basically. Prussia did more damage to the world than people can imagine. This myth is so powerful. This myth of World War II and this consensus. What is consensus? Consensus is democracy. Democracy is a form of consensus, right? So the World War II consensus is the elites that are in power, that's political power in this case, all agree that war is bad, and therefore, right? They all agree that, well, war might be necessary in some cases, but we should try to contain or control it or make it go in a certain direction. That is based on these values that were more or less sort of created out of thin air as the result of World War II. That's where these values came from. They weren't pre-existing values, we'll say. They weren't values that are even Western, actually. They are manufactured values, manufactured in the United States primarily. They're not the values of the United Kingdom at all. And they're certainly not the values of continental Europe. And that remains true to this day, right? United Kingdom doesn't have free speech. It never had free speech. Nowhere in the world had free speech or has free speech. Maybe a couple tiny places, exceptions, but they're relatively recent. Only the United States had that. So if you want to do free speech as a value, everybody else is copying free speech as a value from the United States. It's not a Western value that came from the ancient Latin and Greek traditions or something like that. It's not even the culmination of Rome, Athens, and Jerusalem or something crazy. It's none of those things. This is unbelievably recent, and it was designed for a specific purpose, but it's certainly not a Western value by any means. But it is an American value for sure. So value like that, a value like gun ownership, which is actually just the ability to defend yourself and your sovereign country. It's the best way to think about that. How did this American nation come to be? We defended not just ourselves, but the sovereignty of our nation or country. Country is actually a better word here, or nations, in Federation of Nations, Colin Woodard. That's a better way to think about that, other than just, quote, gun ownership. Yeah, the United States came to be through gun ownership. That's how it happened. It couldn't have happened any other way. Perfectly reasonable argument. And so that is a value that is not shared in the UK. It's not shared in continental Europe. They believe, because of the disintegration of the monarchy, basically, they believe that this sovereignty doesn't really exist and you should just do what the government says. And most of the people act that way. Whether they say they believe that or not is kind of irrelevant. They kind of act that way. We saw that with the COVID fake news virus scam, which I had a chat about here in case you haven't seen it. It's quite good. I know it's a live stream. You'll have to listen to the monologue. It's not that long. It's a long monologue, but it's not that long. It'll be worth your time. So we see that some people will just kind of go along to get along sort of thing, and some people will rebel at every chance they get in every enclave possible. That's the United States. It's always been that way in the United States, with the exception of a few issues like the World War, right? The Great War in particular, there was enough, oh no, these are our ancestors, we need to help protect the sanctity or something, the sacredness of our heritage. Right, because everybody in the United States is actually from over there, pretty much, with very few exceptions. And so, we're looking at that. And when you talk about something like American Empire, which comes from World War II, why? Well, because suddenly America is actually occupying territories that weren't freed from the British. That happened, right? Now we're occupying parts of Germany. We're occupying all kinds of places all over the world, right? Japan, our two biggest external bases are Germany and Japan still, right? We're occupying all kinds of islands in the Pacific and islands in the Caribbean, and we're making deals, and we've got bases in the Middle East and all kinds of other places we don't belong. And you can invoke empire there, even though I think it's the wrong term. Our power and influence comes from our success and the mimetic rivalry, to invoke a little bit of René Girard, because that's actually quite, some of that is actually quite correct. This is mimetic rivalry around the US. If you don't believe me, the history videos with Adam, this one in particular, talks about that. Right, that's the frontier of ideas. The United States, for better or for worse, usually for worse, at least for Europe, is the frontier of ideas. And that's just destroying the world. Western values, this idea of Western values is destroying the world. So this all comes out of World War II. And this consensus idea is just, the political elites, the political class, if you will, because classes are not optional. If you think your society doesn't have or doesn't need classes, you just don't understand hierarchy, and you don't understand the world, and you don't understand that people are different. Of course, that's not optional. You have to have classes. We tried to replace the noble class with the political class, roughly speaking. That bleeds into the merchant class. Sure, that absolutely. That's part of what's happening. All of this is part of either, what caused the myth of World War II to coalesce, we'll say, or a direct result of the myth of World War II. So we have to control these things. We can't just let people run around and commit genocide everywhere, right? And without defining genocide, and without defining like who's stopping what and how and at what cost, and is this a good idea, right? Like we don't even know. Um, we didn't do any of that. Instead, we formed things like the UN, which comes from a disastrous Woodrow Wilson project, right, called the League of Nations, which blew up, and all the idealists like lost their idealism as the result of the Treaty of Versailles. By the way, again, should have been a hint. I guess it wasn't. So all of these things have come together. This idea of Western values, this idea that there's a political class that is in charge and has to do something about it, and then they have to control the people. Well, what mechanism do they do for that? Oh, well, they grab the fourth estate, roughly speaking, and they control the fourth estate. Even though we have freedom of speech in the United States, they still control the fourth estate because the fourth estate agrees with some of this. They say, all right, well, you give us our class distinction as the fourth estate. And I know that comes from the UK, but still, we co-opted it, the United States. So now you have kind of two classes, right? You've got the fourth estate class, right, which is really just rising from the merchant class and selling information. Again, we're in the age of gnosis, this propositional tyranny where knowledge is words, and therefore words are power, because knowledge is the highest value, right? Ooh, right. And no wonder we strayed right into quote postmodern thinking. Yeah, of course, because they want the control. They want to give the control to themselves. It's always goes back to the individual, right? So once you kind of understand, oh, that's where postmodernism comes from. It's actually the acknowledgement that the fourth estate has some form of influence. It's not true power. I have a different definition of power. I'll try to link it here. But they have this influence, and they're in bed with the government, and that forms something powerful. Sure, absolutely, right? Powers and principalities with an S, principalities, right? And when they combine, well, what does that do, right? So you have this momentum around this thing where you've got the fourth estate, which is now a class. Whether it should be or not is a different video, right? You've got the political class, which is a class. Whether or not it should be, different video, right? I could go on for hours about this stuff. And then those two are in cahoots to some extent, and maybe they should be to some extent, provided they're both oriented towards the good, which clearly nowadays neither is, or at least not enough, right? Maybe they should be, because they always were. Like that, the idea of the flow of information being controlled by the sovereign was, of course, and it was never completely controllable, and fair enough. But all the uprisings and revolutions, where everybody dies and then there's a civil war, those things, with the exception of one, which is why I don't think the American Revolution is a revolution. It's a rebellion. Again, you can see my history videos with Adam, which you should do anyway, because they're awesome for other reasons. That all plays into this, right? Because these classes that are trying to emerge and sort of take on the duties of the noble class need some justification in a mythos, and that mythos is the World War II mythos. That's where it comes from. All of this idea that things should be working this way, and in the beginning, because we had lots of good people. Why do we have good people? Because we had hard times, actually, right? Like we had these two wars, maybe, well, one war with two acts, right? And so from that, great men were born, which is an unusual circumstance, right? There's not going to be another J.R.R. Tolkien anytime soon, guys. First we have to have a big enough catastrophe to forge one in fire, if you will, perhaps in the fires of Mount Doom itself, because that's going to happen again. Unfortunately, I wish I were wrong about that, but quick go over of history, just the highlights. And it does seem on the horizon, but it still takes 10 to 20 to 30 years after that for the greatness of those men to take effect, because things build through momentum, right? And so that momentum has to knock the momentum, we'll say, of the myth of World War II off, right? And it's so powerful that you can go either way. You can make the argument that Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings because of his experience in the first act of the Great War, right? And maybe living through the second act or something like that. Or Or you could say the reason why we draw that parallel is because of that event, but he was pointing to something even greater, which would be my argument, that had nothing to do with the contemporary events that he lived through, for example, which I think is true, right? Which is what makes a really, really deep and good and interesting story or myth, right? Is that it has this sort of way of drawing things together that makes sense to you and allows you to make sense of things that aren't explicitly stated in the story. That's what upgrades a story to a myth. So I think Tolkien's work transcends the myth of World War II. And when we reduce it to World War II tropes, we'll call them, we're missing a great deal, right? We're missing a great deal. And it's interesting to me because you still kind of see this. So again, we've got the political consensus, which is democracy for the political class, not for you and I. So see, we're not in the political class. If you're watching this video, you're almost certainly not in the political class. Although maybe I wish a bunch of people who are in the political class would watch all my videos. That might help them, actually. At least otherwise I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think it helped a great number of people. So those people believe that their vote on how the world should be and how we should interfere, so they're mostly cooperating. They have a consensus. That means it's based in cooperation first. It's not based in war. Nobody wants the war, right? But you look at something like Ukraine. Well, who do I side with? Because I can't side with both. Okay. So this consensus idea is very tricky, because if most of the people are on the wrong side and they don't have the capacity to change anything because they don't even have militaries anymore, to the extent they do, they wouldn't make a difference in that conflict anyway. Well, who should be calling the shots then? Right. So this consensus idea doesn't really hold up. It never did. The ancient Greeks wrote about why democracy doesn't work. Well, there you go. It doesn't work in a class, much less in a greater population. We know this. This is a foolish idea. So that idea of consensus is to keep the democracy, but keep it in the class of politics. And you can still see that momentum going. How does that momentum play into every day? Well, the people who, we'll say, aren't political actors or players, or don't even want to be, or maybe don't have the capacity to be, maybe they're bad public speakers, or maybe they can't think about things like policies, or maybe they just reject anything that looks like structure or the machine, right? That's possible. Those people, they just need a simple way to understand the world. Oh, well, Hitler bad, not Hitler, not necessarily bad, right? Oh, killing people, your own population bad. Okay, well, maybe, but then Stalin's bad, and oh, you still like communism because communism's for the low IQ crowd. I hate to break it to you, it just is. I go over that here, the trick of socialism, how it kind of fools you. So all of these things play into this momentum of the myth of World War II. And look, there's a lot more to this. Obviously, I have to give kind of broad strokes, but there's so many things about the way you think and believe and the way our education system formed you, and the fact that your education system is your primary mode of formation and not your parents. This is all born of the myth of World War II. The rise of psychology is all about the myth of World War II. How did Hitler do it? That's actually all, not all, but mostly psychology, right? And so you can understand it psychologically, right? And then from this is born Ellul and propaganda and all that craziness, and then Baudrillard, like all of this stuff about what's real and what's illusion, what's a simulation, what's a simulacra. This is all born out of the same milieu, if you will. If you'll afford me some small French, which is a language I never mastered. I can barely speak English. Give me a break with 2 languages. So this is the crucible from which many things pop out. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'll just tell you it's a bad thing. Like pretty across the board, right? Psychology is a terrible idea. It's probably the worst thing going right now is psychology. It's very damaging. It's very individualistic. I mean, it's inherently individualist. It's very damaging. I'm not saying that Freud and Jung intended it that way. I'm saying that's what happened, right? This idea that politics has something to do with consensus has bled down to, well, we'll ignore bad election results to uphold democracy. What? I mean, it's not just happening in the U.S., although it clearly happened in the U.S., guys. Clearly, just by the number. Do the math. It's not that hard, right? But I mean, it's happening all over the place. The idea that you should manipulate elections by generating false consensus, like making up votes in countries using Dominion voting machines, which we know happens, well documented, right? This idea that that's a valid way to manipulate a government, like, this is all born of this political consensus nonsense, which is born of this democratic idea, right? All of this stuff is wrapped up, maybe not caused by initially or whatever, because none of the ideas from the myth of World War II are new. None of them. They're all old ideas that have been hanging out for a couple thousand years, in some cases longer, right? The question is, how did they all come together and create the sort of urgent catastrophe that we have now? Because I think it is an urgent catastrophe that we have now in many ways. I'm a big fan of the meaning crisis, and of course the intimacy crisis is the real source of our problems through the materialism, which was pre-existing the myth of World War II. But it's not as much of a problem until it gets brought together with these other things in the myth. That's what makes it dangerous. That's what causes things to fall apart. That's where things go horribly wrong. Now, the seeds of them going horribly wrong were sown long ago, but as with real seeds in the wild, if you've ever planted a garden, lots of things have to go right for seeds. If you plant them too early, they don't grow. If you overwater them, they don't grow. If there's too much sun, they don't grow. If they're planted at the wrong depth, they don't grow. Like, there's a lot of things that have to go right to make a seed grow. And not to mention a bunch of seeds that forms, for lack of a better term, a jungle of tightly knit ideas that don't work. And it's very hard to see that they don't work at first. It's very hard to convince somebody that democracy is just a bad idea. The ancient Greeks had it right when they said this. Plato had it right in the Republic as to why this doesn't work. See the middle of book 8. Right, these are bad ideas. They're bad ideas for well understood and well known and well documented reasons. But we don't go back into the past before the myth of World War II. You'll notice, and what are people trying to do now? Now they're trying to poke holes in the myth of World War II as a way of creating a new mythos, right? Or maybe returning to an old mythos, although I don't think people are doing that very well if they are indeed trying to do that. So that is sort of where we're at, and why understanding that there is a myth of World War II is important. And look, I know I covered a lot of stuff. I had to gloss over stuff. There's stuff I have references to on the channel. There's other stuff that I maybe don't have references to, but you can look it up. It's possible to be done, especially with these handy little internet demons that will tell us whatever we want to know. Unfortunately, that means you can also justify any bad idea that you have instantaneously, because the information to justify a bad idea is also on the internet. But you can look up what I've told you, and if it's a convincing outline that I've made that helps you make sense of the world, then you should use it, right? Irrespective of how much counter information you find or counterfactuals you can have that maybe show that that's incorrect. Although I'd be a little suspicious. I didn't make too many claims, I think, that aren't the only conclusions you can draw from the data, but people can draw funny things from data. So, but hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, please comment below, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And listen, I really appreciate that you're watching my channel, and I hope that you're getting something out of it. If you're not, don't watch. That's fine by me. But I'm really trying to help you to understand what we're going through in a way that gives you comfort, right? And doesn't cause more anxiety, because anxiety is the name of the game on the internet, and I am not playing that game. I hope you appreciate that, and I thank you for your time, energy, and attention.